When it comes to weapons in D&D, not all of them were created equal, and many are considered to be mechanically subpar. On top of this, the rulebooks don't provide us much detail on these weapons, leaving us to fill in the gaps of how our weapons look and feel. Due to this lack of information, I'd like to go through and examine all the weapons of D&D to answer: what is this weapon, both in history and in D&D? How is it different from the other weapons available? And does it need to be made better, and how can we do so? For today's video, let's look at the most effective bladed weapon across human history: the spear. A spear is a tool and weapon that consists of a shaft, usually of wood, and a pointed head. The head may be the sharpened end of the shaft itself, or it can be made of a more durable material fastened to the shaft, such as bone, flint, copper, iron, or steel. Measuring between 1 and 3 meters, spears could be wielded with either 1 or 2 hands, with longer variants requiring 2 hands to use properly. As a weapon, the spear is generally broken down into 2 subcategories: those designed for thrusting as a melee weapon, such as a pike or lance, and those designed for throwing as a ranged weapon, such as a javelin or dart. Archaeological discoveries have dated human spear use as far back as 400,000 BC, ranking it among one of the earliest tools developed by humans. From 200,000 BC onwards, Middle Paleolithic humans began to use stone spearheads fixed to the shaft with resin or leather straps. Spear throwers like the atlatl were also found to be in use, but there were already clear design differences between melee spears and throwing spears by 9500 BC. The spear grew to prominence in the Classical era as a cheap, dependable, and effective weapon. In the 7th century BC, the ancient Greeks used the spear to develop the iconic phalanx, a close infantry formation made up of hoplites equipped with a circular bronze shield and a 2-meter-long spear. Further east in China and India, the spear was a common weapon from the 2nd century BC to the 3rd century AD. While initially wielded in infantry formations like the shield wall, Asian spears would also develop into longer, lance-like weapons for cavalry charges. Back in Europe, the early Romans were copying the Greeks' homework and equipped their infantry with the hasta spear, a 2-meter-long spear made of ash with an iron head. By the time of the early Republic, however, the hastati and principes were already being rearmed with the gladius shortsword and the pilum javelin, with only the triarii continuing to use the hasta. In the later Roman Empire, the cavalry-focused barbarian invasions of the Germans, Dacians, and Scythians prompted the Western Romans to adopt the spear as a mainline weapon once again. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the spear and shield continued to be used by nearly all Western European cultures. The Vikings, for instance, although often portrayed with an axe or sword, were armed mostly with spears, as were their Anglo-Saxon, Irish, or continental contemporaries. Since a medieval spear required only a small amount of steel along the sharpened edges, the spear was quick and easy to manufacture. In the later Middle Ages, however, technological innovation began pushing the spear out of favor. The wider adoption of stirrups and the high cantle saddle developed cavalry spears into their own weapon, the lance. Among the infantry, spears began to fall out of fashion in favor of pole weapons that combined the thrusting properties of the spear with the cutting capabilities of an axe, such as a halberd or poleaxe. Where spears were retained, they grew into pikes, which would be a dominant infantry weapon in the Renaissance era. As with many medieval weapons, the advent of gunpowder continued to push spears off the battlefield. While early pike and shot tactics were very effective in Renaissance Europe, spears and polearms continued to decline in popularity, used as late as the 19th century before being supplanted by modern firearms. While largely obsolete on modern battlefields, the legacy of the spear does live on. In 1606, a Chinese military treatise outlined the use of a bayonet on the end of a breech-loading musket. This gunblade, as it was called, caught on with militaries across the world, spurring the development of bayonets that could turn any long rifle into a pseudo-spear. While these also fell out of favor after World War I, bayonets are still issued to armed forces to this very day, allowing even the most advanced assault rifle to act as a spear.
Fix bayonets!
Outside of this use, however, spears have been relegated to various martial arts as well as the movies that depict them. In D&D, the spear is described as a simple two-handed melee weapon in the polearm family. Typically made of wood, their tips could be formed by just sharpening the shaft to a point, or by attaching spearheads made from metal, stone, ivory, and even coral. In older editions, the spear would cost 1 gold piece, weighed between 1.4 and 2.7 kilograms, and dealt either 1d6 or 1d8 piercing damage. In 5th edition, the spear costs 1 gold piece, weighs 1.4 kilograms, deals 1d6 piercing damage when held in one hand, and has the thrown and versatile weapon properties. When it comes to the spear in D&D, it's actually a really good simple melee weapon. With a 1d6 damage die, it has similarities to the other 1d6 weapons like the javelin and quarterstaff, but the addition of the versatile property helps it stand on its own 2 feet. The versatile weapon property states that the weapon can be used in 1 or 2 hands. When held in one hand, it deals 1d6 piercing damage, but when held in 2 hands, the spear deals 1d8 damage. With this weapon property, the spear can rival the damage potential of the great club, or even some martial weapons, at the cost of needing both hands to do so. On top of that, the spear has the thrown weapon property, which allows the spear to be effectively thrown with a normal range of 20 feet and a long range of 60 feet. With all this in mind, the spear is a flexible piercing weapon that can fit with a variety of character builds. Melee tanks can wield it one-handed with a shield, damage dealers can wield it in 2 hands to deal as much damage as a Morningstar for a fraction of the gold cost, and it can be thrown up to 60 feet at hard-to-reach enemies. While not as good at any one particular thing as more specialized weapons, the spear is a jack-of-all-trades that properly portrays its place as one of the most effective bladed weapons in history. With that being said, you're probably looking at the runtime and wondering why I'm even going into this next section. Yes, the spear is very good as a melee weapon option in D&D, possibly one of the best simple melee weapons alongside the hand axe. However, even with how good it is now, I still want to take a look at whether adding more unique features can make it better, while keeping it in line with the other weapons of 5th edition. So, while we're not necessarily fixing the spear, let's take a look at some ideas on how we can keep it viable and make it more fun to use. My first suggestion is to add a special ready action to the spear. In 3rd edition, when wielding a spear, a character had the ability to use a ready action to set their spear against a charge, which was a special action that allowed a character to move up to twice their move speed and attack during the action. If a readied spear struck a charging character, it would deal double damage with the attack. This action not only fits into how spears were historically braced against cavalry or infantry charges, but it also adds a unique twist to the ready action that often gets overlooked in the greater action economy. If we were to implement this idea into 5th edition, we could add a weapon property called Spear Wall, which stated that when a character has the spear equipped, they can use their ready action to set up a spear wall. When a creature enters the threatened area of a character using Spear Wall, the readied character can make an opportunity attack with their spear. If that attack hits, the character can roll extra dice for the attack's damage against a target, as if it were a critical hit. While this property would conflict with one aspect of the Polearm Master feat, the proposed feature would cost an action to ready the Spear Wall and then a reaction to activate it, whereas Polearm Master automatically grants opportunity attacks without having to spend an action. So, something like Spear Wall can bring a fun but costly action option to the spear while not completely invalidating the Polearm Master feature. My second suggestion on how to keep the spear fun and viable in D&D is to add Pathfinder 2nd Edition's expanded critical effects that they have for spears. In Pathfinder, when a critical strike is rolled with a weapon, that weapon's group adds an additional effect onto the attack. For spears, this effect pierces the target, weakening their attacks and rendering them clumsy until the start of your next turn. The clumsy effect adds a stat penalty to armor class, reflex saves, ranged attack rolls, and dexterity-based skill checks. But that amount of math for a one-round status effect might be a bit too crunchy for 5th edition. Instead, a 5th edition version of this effect could state that when a critical strike is rolled with a spear, it pierces the target, imposing disadvantage on melee and ranged attacks until the start of your next turn. By rewording it in this way, the spirit of the effect is still the same, imposing disadvantage on their attacks to weaken them without requiring players to do a ton of math. My third and final suggestion for how to keep the spear fun and viable is to add a throwing strap as a piece of equipment that, when equipped, increases the range of spears to 30 feet normally and 120 feet at disadvantage. Throwing straps like the Addle Addle were used for spears across history, and while increasing the thrown range to 120 feet would bring it to the same level as a javelin, I believe that making it on par with a normal javelin or sling keeps the spear competitive as a ranged option. This throwing strap could also come with a negative, such as providing disadvantage on melee attacks made with spears or other weapons while equipped, to further emphasize the specialization into thrown weapons. This gives characters who want to lean into a throwing build a piece of equipment that they can work towards to make their thrown weapons as good as ranged weapons, without adding in extra mechanics or damage numbers that complicate combat. I will note that I did add this suggestion to the javelin as well, but while the spear would do the same damage and have slightly lower range than the javelin with a throwing strap, this provides players with a choice that they get to make themselves. Do they take spears, which are mainly melee weapons but can be thrown, or do they take javelins, which are mainly meant as throwing weapons? These types of choices, while small, reinforce to the player that something as simple as their equipment can represent their ability to build their character how they want, rather than how they should. Now, these are just a few of my own suggestions on how to keep the spear as a viable equipment choice in 5th edition. As I mentioned before, the spear doesn't need tweaking as much as some of the other D&D weapons do. But if we're adding new abilities and features to other weapons to make them more fun and viable, we should do that for all of them, so that every weapon choice feels rewarding, impactful, and, most important of all, fun. However, That's going to bring us to the end of today's video on the spear. The king of all weapons, the spear is actually represented fairly well in D&D. But that doesn't mean that we can't try to elevate it even further with some fun features that set it apart from other weapons. However, what I want to know is, what do you think of the spear? Do you think it doesn't need any changes at all? Do you agree with some of the suggestions I put forward? Or do you think that we didn't go far enough in making the spear better than it already is in D&D? You can let me know down in the comments, or you can discuss it on the Alt-Roll Discord using the link in the description. While on the server, you can pop into our courses that teach the basics of D&D, and if you like what we do, supporting us on our Ko-fi goes a long way in helping us keep Alt-Roll going. However, that's all I had for you. Thank you all for watching, make sure to have a great rest of your day, and I'll see all of you next time.